Hello, everyone. Let's talk about what's new in the 8.0 major release of the Python Elasticsearch client. So my name's Seth Larson. I am a software engineer at Elastic. I maintain all of the Python clients for Elastic services like Elasticsearch and Enterprise Search. And outside of work, I work on open source libraries like Requests and urlib3. So the theme of the 8.0 release is improving the dev experience. We deprecated and removed some of the harder to use components, and we were trying to make the client more consistent and easier to integrate into your projects while still maintaining backwards compatibility. Okay, so the format of this talk is going to be, I'm going to show a couple pairs of slides, one for 7x and one for 8.0, and on each slide is going to be code on the left and some text on the right. If you don't want to look at the code, that's totally fine. You can just look at the text. They kind of describe the same thing. And we're going to compare the 7x version to the 8.0 version. So the first is body fields. In 7x, we really only had path and query parameters be top-level parameters for each API method. And then there was always a single parameter body method for that kind of accepted the entire JSON body in it. And so the unfortunate part about that is that the body parameter contains a lot of the complexity of the API. And so we're not able to give all the niceties that you would get with a parameter from things like autocomplete, doc strings, type hints. You get all of those for free with parameters. We couldn't give you those. So in 8.0, we're moving all of the top level body fields to be their own parameter. And so this leads to things like better discovery. You get the doc strings and the type hints. And the other nice thing is you don't have to think about where your parameters are going to be serialized. So in the other example, track total hits and size were both being serialized into the query string, but now they'll be serialized in the body, which is a lot better because you get to take advantage of compression. Okay, the next problem is client and API parameters. So they're kind of ambiguous because right now in 7x, the API parameters for the client and for the actual API method itself are in the exact same method. So if you look at grant API key, it takes an API key, but that also conflicts with the name API key that we have as a per request method as well for the client. And then if you look at indices delete, you can't really tell if that ignore 404 is a part of the API or if that's a client parameter. So now in 8.0, we have this solution is a new options method on the client. And so what this method does is it separates client parameters from actual API parameters. You can see in the example using API key, it's now really easy to see which API key is being used to authenticate and which API key is actually being passed as a part of the API. And then in the bottom, you can see ignore status 404. It's really easy to tell that that is not a part of the API. It's configuring the client itself. And so all of the per API call parameters are there. So the ignore status and authentication are there, but then there's also timeouts, retries, and request tracing via opaque ID. Okay, so the final problem is API responses and errors. So right now in 7x, when you get a successful response back, it's just a simple deserialized object. In a lot of cases, it'll be a dictionary containing deserialized JSON. But then if you get a failed response back, it'll be an exception that will only have a status code, and the body itself is different way to access that information. But then the other thing is that even on a successful response, you can't get the status code or any other sort of transport information like headers or which node serviced that call. And so it's really tough to know kind of what happened and what the actual response was without going to a lower level. And so with 8.0, we now have a lot more simple way of accessing these values. So meta gets a status, headers, and the node that serviced the request. And then there's a body parameter, which is the raw deserialized body. And so this is backwards compatible completely. So if you access the response via the hits, as is used in the example there, it will instead access .body for you. So you don't have to change any of the code. That's totally fine. And then if you look at the actual API error exception, you can see that it mirrors exactly with .meta and status, headers, and body. And so if you have an API that accepts either a successful or unsuccessful API response or API error, it can handle both without having to change the logic. Okay, and that's it. So if you're kind of excited by the things that you saw, you can download the Elasticsearch client from the Python package index with pip install Elasticsearch. And then on the documentation, there's actually a migration guide, which will show you how to upgrade your Elasticsearch index and then upgrade the actual client itself and migrate your application. And then because this is very new, if you find any issues, you can report them on GitHub, which also includes our source code. It's all open source. So excited to see what you build.